In Half-Life 2: Raising the Bar, Josh Wire says that puzzles in downtime are like a sorbet in a multi-course meal, and that they allow the player to better appreciate whatever action comes next. Without these pacing contrasts, everything becomes a numbing blur of relentless action, which winds up being fatiguing and not very fun after a while. This quote is in the book section on the Ravenholm level, but you can see that this idea was applied to every level of Half-Life 2. The whole game rarely uses music, and when it does, it doesn't last for very long. Combat is divided into deliberately placed set pieces, with most of the game time actually involving more exploration and scavenging than firefights. And once those fast, loud firefights are over and done with, the game gets very, very quiet. It's full of quiet time, and quiet time is actually a really important aspect of narrative-driven action games, but it's sorely neglected in some of the biggest action games around. I first wanted to talk about this stuff after playing the campaign of Call of Duty Ghosts, and you can probably imagine why. The Call of Duty campaigns are non-stop action. They're not totally lacking in quiet time, but they are lacking in moments where the narrative of the game just shuts up for a minute and lets you explore quiet places by yourself. During scenes where you're not supposed to be intensely concentrating on the combat, you're supposed to be intensely concentrating on following someone's backside. I also noticed this problem a few years earlier when I played Saints Row 3 for the first time. The whole game is a non-stop barrage of either over-the-top action or over-the-top humor, and it wasn't evenly distributed. Spoiler alert, the end of the game that I chose has you shooting your way up a tall statue with Bonnie Tyler music in the background, but the beginning of the game has you diving through airplanes in mid-air and crashing in and out of wreckage with skydiving gunplay along the way, and I guess what that shows us is that without some more spacing between the ridiculousness, it's hard to tell what's not supposed to be ridiculous. And that's what Quiet Time does. It helps the viewer appreciate the loudness of the action so that we can be better prepared for it, and also understand why it's important. Now, this rant here is really applicable to a very specific genre of games, narrative-driven action games, which also happens to be the most lucrative genre around these days. Even though Call of Duty barely has any downtime, it topped the industry's sales for much of the last decade, and that's likely because there's a lot more value in the multiplayer game than the short single-player campaigns, and that doesn't really tie into the same type of storytelling that the single-player does. But this concept is arguably applicable to most any kind of storytelling out there. It's got a lot to do with the pacing of the experience. Tarkovsky's Stalker movie has a 5-minute scene where the characters are just riding a tram while some quiet music plays, and it's surprisingly entertaining and enjoyable to watch. The Stalker games have 5-minute bursts of you just throwing screws into the air, and that's surprisingly entertaining too. Quiet time does not have to be added to the detriment of the action. It's there to accentuate it. It can give the player a rest in preparation for that action, or vary up the gameplay with non-violent activities like puzzles or dialogue. It can be used to take advantage of the less interactive merits of video games, like exploration and environmental storytelling, or just the sheer pleasure of hiking through some pretty landscapes or taking a scenic drive. Quiet time helps compare the action to whatever is not supposed to be action, and it actually ties into the deliberate arrangement of the entirety of a game's content, from how the music system works to how fast-paced the combat is to how the level design funnels the player through the game. And balancing out all of those pieces to make room for quiet time can really end up making a game feel so much more fleshed out. Regulating just how much of the game the player is exposed to is a challenge of exposition. You don't want to spoil the biggest thrills early on, and you generally want players to feel mentally engaged on their way to the end. And a lot of developers are really frustrated with how few players get hooked enough to actually get to the end of that single-player campaign, but if you're trying to hook the player for that many hours, then the way a game distributes its content suddenly becomes more important than the content itself. Quiet time is a moment for the player to slow down and think. It's a moment for the developers to use subtext to get the player pondering about what else is going on in the story. It can make players feel smart by hiding relevant story details in the environments, or it can make players feel concentrated and scared by simply ramping up the tension. Just look at Resident Evil 4, for example. It was reviewed as a game all about relentlessly exciting white-knuckle action, even though most of the actual gameplay is spent quietly walking around areas that have no enemies at all. Maybe a part of the reason why it was so exciting lies with the level design. Maybe the high consequences of its punishing combat was spaced apart enough to make it feel meaningful. Level design may just be the most important aspect of a narrative-driven action game. Levels are essentially what dictate the pacing of the whole story. Level design is what decides the flow between scenes of dialogue, drama, and combat, and also the quiet and more introspective moments scattered between them. Anyways, I also just finished playing Metal Gear Rising and noticed that even the craziness of those games have moments of quiet time where you're encouraged to go on little item hunts by yourself at your own pace, without any prodding encouragement from other characters. Hell, even Doom and Quake managed to squeeze a reasonable amount of that stuff in. As much as people like to complain about keycard hunts in those games, I feel like the overall package would have ultimately been worse off without them. Some of the most beloved action games ever seem to value quiet time more than the alternatives. Dark Souls has no regular background music at all. The levels are completely quiet, empty, and moody, and that complements the atmosphere of the whole game. The only music you ever hear happens during boss battles, and that's probably because they're the fastest and most desperate moments of the game, whereas outside of them, the game encourages you to play slowly and cautiously. Metal Gear Solid 3 has no ambient background music. The game is completely silent unless you've been spotted by an enemy, and since it's a stealth game, that's exactly the thing you're trying to avoid. There's a much more serene and patient feel to the game when you're unnoticed. It's just nature sounds, and that reflects the slow pacing of its stealth. And once you do get spotted and that loud music rips up, it's easy to tell that the game is drawing a very clear line between two states of play. These games are built with systems that use quiet time to influence how you're supposed to play depending on the situations you get yourself into. But on the other hand, Call of Duty Ghosts has no real hands-off, player-driven quiet time that I can remember. The most player-driven gameplay moment has you being stalked in the jungle by overpowering enemies, so it's not like you can relax, and it mechanically reels in one over-the-top, ridiculous scripted spectacle after another, without holding off the bigger spectacles for the end. It uses its loading screens for exposition dumps without incorporating exposition into the level, and the stuff you do in those levels is not consistent at all thanks to drastically different gameplay that comes from all the drastically different scripted sequences. You don't have time to think for yourself and take in the moment. You are always being prodded along by very loud people telling you what to do against a loud soundtrack peppered by loud sound effects. But isn't the one Call of Duty level that everyone seems to enjoy the most one of the quieter moments in the series? All Gillied Up wasn't exactly downtime, but it was a lot more quieter than your typical gameplay. And it's kind of funny to see the series try to follow in the footsteps of that one level, but it also shows that presenting non-stop action without taking some kind of break is usually not an effective way to tell a story. There's a lot to gain from tastefully dipping into some quiet time, from letting us explore a lush forest all by ourselves, or taking a slow drive into the sunset with some appropriate music, or just something basic like searching through a cleared area for items you might have missed. And a lot of games out there just dismiss how much they could have added to the experience by letting the player stop and smell the roses for a minute.